everyone. The topic for today's lecture is the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty was signed by the representatives of the Empire of China and the representatives of the British Crown in the year 1842, after China was defeated in the First Opium War. I have divided this lecture into three parts. In the first part, I am going to talk about the events and the background leading to the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. In the second part, I will discuss about the Treaty of Nanking and then analyze it. And in the concluding part, I'll talk about the impact of the Treaty of Nanking in the history of China. The Canton trade, or the trade in China, which centered around the port of Canton in the 18th century, was very much tilted in favor of China. Foreign traders who came to purchase Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain had to pay for things in silver or gold, as they found that in China there was no demand for European product. This was because of the fact that in China, the Confucian ideology was followed, which said that China is the Middle Kingdom and it was so bountiful that it required no external product. If any country wants to trade with China, they would have to submit to the Chinese emperor, and trade was not a right but was a mark of favor to the foreigners. Frequently, it was seen that 90% of the shipment, particularly of the leading company, that is the East India Company's trade, was consisted of silver or gold bullion and only 10% in commodities. This balance of trade continued to be in favor of China till the mid-1820s, when a sort of an equilibrium was established. After 1826, the balance gradually tilted on the other way, that is, in favor of the East India Company. And between the year 1831 and 1838, it was seen that millions of silver bullion flowed out of China. This was possible due to the growing demand of one commodity, which resulted in this huge disruption, and that was opium. Opium was known to the Chinese through the Arabs and the Turks, who introduced this in the 7th and 8th century. This was chiefly used as a painkiller or a pain reliever, and chiefly for medicinal purposes. Only from the 17th century, opium smoking started to be used as a pleasure activity, and that also particularly by the rich and the upper class. According to historian Emanuel Shu, gradually the fad that started with the rich class soon eventually percolated to the poorer sections of society. The demand for opium led to the provinces to import it, and in fact, in certain provinces, it was even cultivated. From a moral perspective, the Chinese Emperor Yuanzhen prohibited the smoking and consumption of opium in the year 1729. Later on, Emperor Qiyaqing not even banned its import, but also banned its cultivation in the year 1796. Later, from the 1820s onwards, it became an economic concern, as it was seen that opium trade caused a major outflow of silver from China. Initially, it was the Portuguese who conducted this opium trade. But from the 1770s onwards, it is the English East India Company which took the lead. This was possible because of the fact that the company established a monopoly in opium cultivation in Bengal. It not only cultivated opium, but also processed it in its factories and made it into a finished good and started exporting it to China. But it had a trick inside it. That is, the company cleverly dissociated itself officially from the opium trade in China, because in China, the trade or the goods of opium were allowed through country traders, only under the license of the company. So the company should not be blamed because it was seen that this trade was of illicit nature since opium trade was banned in China. And as this trade was of illicit nature, all the transactions of this trade was done in cash, that is silver bullion. The rapid rise in opium import was connected with the rapid rise in the growing demand for opium in China. The addicts in the early 19th century were mostly young men from the affluent families, but gradually this habit spread to people of other walks of life like government officials, scholar gentry. Even it was seen that merchants, scholars, women, peasants, laborers, soldiers, and even monks, nuns, and priests. The economic fallout of opium was tremendous, leave alone its physical impact. Economically, it was seen that the spending capacity of the Chinese were weakened because most of the Chinese people were spending for buying of the opium. So trade was in a slump, and there was rampant corruption on the part of in China in the ports, for which the law was definitely not enforced. Emmanuel Shu believes that in the ineffectiveness of the Chinese prohibition was matched by the enterprising promotion of this trade by the British. In the year 1832, East India Company made 10 million rupees from opium sale. In the year 1837, it was 20 million, and in the next year, in 1838, it had jumped to 30 million. So it was making huge profit from this opium trade. To tide over this problem, the Chinese emperor sent the very efficient and renowned scholar official in China, whose name was Lin Sesu, as the commissioner of Canton in the year 1839 to wipe out the opium menace. Commissioner Lin arrived in Canton, and after making a thorough investigation about the opium trade, he ordered that all the foreign traders must surrender the opium hold that they have, and also they should pledge that if they want to trade in China, in Canton, they have to refrain themselves from trading in opium. When the foreign merchants failed to submit to Commissioner Lin's demand and they did not surrender their opium reserve, Commissioner Lin ordered the stoppage of this trade. He also asked the withdrawal of the Chinese compradors and servants who worked in the factories of the foreign traders, and even a siege of the factories. He also imprisoned some of the Hong merchants who acted as agents of some of the leading opium merchants. All these resulted in the stagnation of opium trade. Captain Charles Elliot, who was the superintendent of the trade for China and a representative of the British Crown, he thought that by surrendering the opium to the commissioner, it would relieve the stagnant trade, and it would be a very good way to hold the Chinese responsible for the cost of destruction of any opium that they do. Thus, he noticed an order through which he asked all the British traders to surrender their opium. By May 1839, Elliot surrendered almost 21,306 chests of opium to Commissioner Lin, which the latter destroyed in the presence of high officials and foreign spectators by digging up trenches, mixing the opium with lime and water and salt, and rendering the opium absolutely useless, and then flushed it into a nearby creek from where the debris went and mixed itself in the ocean. After this, all the foreign traders left Canton for Macau. In the meantime, Captain Elliot started urging the British government to do prompt action against the Chinese government. Meanwhile, almost 300 commercial firms of London, Liverpool, and Manchester connected with the Chinese trade asked the British Crown to involve itself and press itself into action. All these were done not in the manner by which it would be too blatant for anyone to see, but in a very, very subtle manner. They said that they want an action against the Chinese government, not because opium trade was stopped, but because the Chinese government was prohibiting them free trade. So they were urging the British Crown to get involved itself into a war for free trade and not for opium. The tense situation in China was further strained by the killing of a Chinese villager by a group of British seamen. Commissioner Lin demanded that the British surrender the culprits so that they can be tried according to the Chinese laws. Elliot refused to submit the British subjects to Chinese law. Thus, on August 1839, all British subjects were forced to leave Macau because Macau, which was under the Portuguese, were forced by the British government that they expel all the British traders from Macau. And thus all the British traders left Macau for Hong Kong, which was a barren island 90 miles from Canton. Then the British Expeditionary Force arrived in Canton under Admiral George Elliot. To the British, the war was to defend the right to trade, to uphold their national honor, to correct the injustice inflicted upon the British officials and subjects in China, and to secure in the future a very conducive atmosphere for trade. For the Chinese, the war was primarily a crusade against opium. The Opium War, which happened in 3 stages over a period of 2 years, with seizing Canton, to seizing other ports of the north, to agreeing to temporary truce. The Opium War continued, but it was always in favor of the British. After various rounds of negotiations, when the King government realized that it will never win a war against the superior naval forces of the British government, they wanted to end hostilities. All these resulted in the signing of a peace treaty, and this led to the signing of the formal Treaty of Canton. Let us pause here for a quiz. The question is, whom did the Chinese emperor send to wipe out opium trade in Canton? The options are: number 1, Scholar Official Commissioner Lin Se-su; number 2, Honk Merchant Kong Kwa; number 3, Governor General of Canton Teng; and number 4, Governor General of Chile Chi Shan. The answer is option 1, Scholar Official Commissioner Lin Se-su. Let me now go to the second part of my presentation. Here I'll talk about the Treaty of Nanking and its analysis. The Treaty of Nanking had 13 articles, and it was signed on a ship which was named Cornwallis on 29 August 1842. In the Chinese side, the emperor was represented by Qi Yang, who was the Tartar general of Canton and later on became the imperial commissioner, and Yi Li Pu, the deputy lieutenant general of the province of Shapu. From the side of the British Crown, the representative was Sir Henry Pottinger, the new plenipotentiary to China. The audience for this treaty was Chinese officials, merchants, city magistrates, whose lives would be altered forever by the presence of the newly enfranchised foreign traders in their midst. It took some time before the reality of the treaty diplomacy to sink inside the mind of the urban population, because it was seen that even after the signing of the treaty, there were several skirmishes which followed for several months afterwards. The tenor of the Treaty of Nanking was quite humiliating for China. The main provisions are: number 1, China had to pay an indemnity of 21 million, out of which 12 million for the war expenditure, 6 million for the destroyed opium, and 3 million for the repayment to the Hong merchants of debts to the British traders. The second most important thing is that the monopolistic co-Hong system of foreign trade was abolished, and also the right to permit or mercantile transactions with other persons were opened. The third thing that was very important and an important clause of this treaty was that the Chinese government was forced to open 5 ports: Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo and Shanghai, thus ending the one-port Canton system of trade, and also allowed British subjects with their families and establishment to reside in any of the 5 ports for purposes on carrying out mercantile pursuits without any hindrance. Another clause of the treaty was the Chinese was forced to cede Hong Kong to the British. Though the Chinese text of the treaty euphemistically state that the emperor graciously grants a place for the British to take rest and to store their wares after a long journey from Europe. Another provision of the treaty was granting equality of foreign correspondence, thus ending the tributary relation that China always insisted with foreign countries. Later, a fixed tariff was to be established. According to Emanuel Shu, the Treaty of Nanking was imposed by the victor upon the vanquished at a gunpoint. Without deliberate or careful deliberations, which generally accompanies international agreements like what happens in Europe or America. It came to be known as the first of the series of unequal treaties that China was forced to sign. There would be many who would join in the course of the coming 19th century, as it marked a watershed moment in the Western discovery that one could get away with anything one wanted in China through violence. The Treaty of Nanking was addressed to posterity and the world opinion, and the commercial powers of the West paid very close attention to it, using the Treaty of Nanking as their own model for future unequal treaties that would be imposed on the East Asian countries till the end of the Second World War. According to historian J.F. Fairbank, the treaty marked a turning point in Far Eastern history, but the accounts of its negotiations available to Western scholars are very, very brief. This is partly due to the fact that the publication of the British documents on China war practically ceased with the Blue Book of 1840, with the essential Chinese documents not published until the year 1930. As a result, there has not been an unnatural tendency to conclude that the draft treaty was presented by the British and signed by the Chinese, and that was the end of it. A most ironic point in this Treaty of Nanking was the question of opium, which was the immediate cause for the Opium War. In fact, opium was not even mentioned. The question of its future status was cautiously avoided by both sides, that is the Chinese as well as the British. The Chinese emperor painfully approved the treaty on September 15th, and Queen Victoria's ratification came on December 28, 1842. The treaty was supplemented in the year 1842 by the British Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue, which allowed British citizens to be tried in the British courts and granted the British any rights in China that China might grant to other countries. This came to be known as the Most Favored Nation Clause. The latter treaty allowed British warships to anchor at any of the 5 ports to protect commerce and control sailors. When the negotiations were taking place, throughout 1841 to 1843, the British government, and more specifically the Foreign Office, was faced with unprecedented problems of all forms of communication. Rarely before had there been such difficulties due to cultural differences and languages in alien script, combined with disruption of negotiation and consultation because of the slow travel time between the negotiating powers. There was a lapse of 6 months for the return journey at that time between China and Britain. Clerks often prepared duplicates of documents and dispatches to be sent by different routes so that the delivery is ensured. It would not be entirely surprising that the practices of the formal preparations of protocol and ratifications differed from that of the actual treaty that was signed between China and Britain. The particular instance of the Treaty of Nanking provides a graphic example of cultural and technical difficulties of the most uncomfortable learning process for both Britain and China's officials who were involved in the negotiations of 1842-43. Close to the heels of the British came the Americans and the French requesting similar treaties. The Chinese, after the defeat in the Opium War, wanted to avoid any future conflicts. In the larger sense, the Treaty of 1842 did far more than settle a trade dispute. It opened a new chapter in the history of the global power and provided a template for the dominance of Western trading nations in East Asia for roughly the next century. As the first of the many of these unequal treaties between modern mercantile nations and traditional East Asian societies, the Treaty of Nanking ushered in an era of treaty diplomacy, an euphemism for economic and political exploitation that defined the contours of Western imperialism in Eastern Asia and confirmed the supremacy of the commercial state worldwide. In general, the unequal treaties were characterized by the imposition of demands for the treaty ports in the host country, the creation of zones in the host country where foreign nationals could live, work, and worship, the establishment of consulates in the treaty cities, the control over tariffs and extraterritoriality, which refers to the right claimed by foreign nationals to remain under the legal jurisdiction of their home countries, even while living and working abroad. In cases in which military operations were required to enforce a treaty, indemnities paid by the host country to the dominant power were also commonly included, and China later signed many of such unequal treaties. Now let us pause here for a quiz. The question is, according to the terms of the Treaty of Nanking, which island was ceded to the British? Number 1, Macau. Number 2, Ningpo. Number 3, Hong Kong. Or number 4, Lintin. The answer is option number 3, that is Hong Kong. Now we are turning to the concluding part of the presentation, that is the impact of the Treaty of Nanking in the history of China. The Treaty of Nanking redefined world diplomacy and helped set the stage for the emergence of new capitalism or imperialism of the late 19th century. The American-sponsored Treaty of Wangxia and the French-sponsored Treaty of Whampoa were signed in 1844, which all of these were based on the Treaty of Nanking, and even then their demands were not complete. Not only did each of these treaties specify terms for extraterritoriality, which the Treaty of Nanking did not, but they also demanded most favored nation status, meaning that the United States and the French would automatically receive any trade privileges granted by China to any other nations in the future. Nevertheless, the treaties of 1842 and 43 left several issues unsettled. In particular, they did not resolve the status of opium traffic in the favor of the British Empire. The opium trade was later legalized under the Treaty of Tientsin, which China concluded after its defeat in the Second Opium War, which was another defeat for the Qing monarchy. These treaties had a deep and lasting effect in the psyche of China. Nanking Treaty, together with the following treaties of 1843, 1854, and 1860, ended the Canton system as created in 1760. These treaties created a new framework for China's foreign relations and overseas trade, which would last for another 100 years and marked the start of what later Chinese nationalists state as the century of Chinese humiliation. From the perspective of modern Chinese nationalists, the most injurious terms were the fixed trade tariff, extraterritoriality, and the clause of the most favored nation, and freeing the importation of British opium, which continued to have social, economic, and political consequences for the Chinese people. In the domain of domestic politics, the Treaty of Nanking demonstrated the weakness of the Qing rulers and precipitated a permanent legitimacy crisis for the Qing dynasty. Less than a decade after the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, the Taiping Rebellion, which would shake China from its foundation, took place. This massive insurrection, informed by explosive anti-foreign and anti-Qing sentiment, ended not only with the foreign help and intervention, but it also strengthened the hands of the treaty powers. Subsequent treaties would sap China of its sovereignty, and rebellions would plague the dynasty for the next 60 years. In many ways, the Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of the end of imperial China, destroying the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty and sending it into a downward spiral from which it could never recover. The quiz is: the Treaty of Nanking resulted in, number 1, the end of the Canton system of trade; number 2, the end of monopolistic Kohong system; number 3, the end of the tributary system; and number 4, all of the above. The answer is number 4, all of the above. Now let us do a summing up of today's lecture. The Treaty of Nanking was the peace treaty which ended the First Opium War, which took place between 1840 and 42, between Great Britain and the Qing dynasty of China on 29th August 1842. It was the first of what the Chinese later term as the unequal treaties. British and Chinese officials negotiated the terms of the treaties on a ship called the Cornwallis, which was anchored in the Yangtze at the city. On 29th August, British representative was Sir Henry Pottinger, and Qing dynasty representatives were Qi Yang, the Tartar general of Canton, who later on became the commissioner, or the imperial commissioner, and Yi Lipu, the deputy lieutenant general of the province of Shapu, who signed the treaty. The treaty consisted of 13 articles. The treaty required China to pay a war indemnity, cede the island of Hong Kong to the British as a colony, to essentially end the Canton system and the Kohong system, and allow trade at 5 treaty ports. It was followed in 1843 by the Treaty of the Bogue, which granted extraterritoriality and most favored nation for the British. The Treaty of Nanking demonstrated the weakness of the Qing rule and precipitated a permanent crisis of legitimacy for the Qing dynasty. Less than a decade after the signing of this treaty, the Taiping Rebellion took place, which had a profound impact in the future of China, from which China never recovered. This was because of the fact that the Taiping Rebellion was not only tremendously anti-king, but it was also anti-foreigner. To quench the rebellion, the Qing dynasty had to take the help of the foreigners, and thus the foreigners' hold over China was firmly entrenched. Subsequent treaties following the Treaty of Nanking were signed between China and later the Americans and the French, whereby China's sovereignty would be further diminished. China would be plagued by continuous rebellion for the coming 60 years. In many ways, the Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of the end of imperial China and the end of the Manchu rule, from which China never recovered. And this ended the period of empire in China, and a republic was established. Thank you.